Good morning, my people. All right, as most of you heard Mike say, I started out of the College of New Jersey as an intern in '99. For those of you not from New Jersey, I assure you it's a real school. Thankfully, Joe and Joanne Savino, who I have the pleasure of following today, who have always been amazing to me throughout my career, knew that as well, so they signed me on as a full-time representative on July 9th of '99. Right after that meeting, and I mean literally right after, I walked with the office manager right to a computer and booked my tickets to annual meeting. And like many of you, that first meeting for me, I was in awe. And there was a small seed planted, no matter how minute the chance might seem, that I'd get a chance to be up on stage to talk to all of you. Now, when I had that idea, the thought that I had around it was significantly different than the way that it happened. But as we've all heard a few times at this meeting, life has a way of changing our plans. So instead today, I'm here to talk about the impact of the work that we do through a very powerful client story. So very early in my career, I made a call to a woman named Tanya. I went out to see her and very, very quickly knew that I had no idea what I was talking about. All right, so I did what every person in here should do, and I found someone smarter than me. And I don't know if he's in here, but I reached out to Art Blick in our office, so thank you, Art, and said, okay, I have this person we need to go see. Thankfully, Tanya met with us again, and we developed a good relationship. Fast forward 7 years later, Tanya gives me a call. She says, Jason, my daughter and son-in-law are about to have their second child, and they need some life insurance. I said, okay, I think we have some. All right? So I took the referral, I made the call, and thankfully they scheduled with me. So it was 1-for-1 that day. Check it off. This was, I can look down here. This was Chris and Brogann and their daughter Stevie in December of 2007 when I met with them. So I sat down at their kitchen table. We did a fact finder. During that meeting, I found out that Chris was a business owner, an athlete, and a coach. I found out that Brogann was a stay-at-home mom at the time, expecting their second daughter very, very shortly. We talked a lot in that meeting about Plan A, which was they wanted to start building retirement savings, and they wanted to put away money for their children's college education. We also talked about Plan B, what could happen, and that led to a discussion around life insurance and disability insurance and disability overhead expense. So I took that information back, put it through our analysis, brought out recommendations, and thankfully, we got together and we implemented life insurance right around the time that their second daughter, Clementine, was born. Through some follow-up, we got the disability insurance in place, and we got the DOE in place in June of '08. Right around that time, they were sick of seeing me, right? So we made plans to have an annual review at some point and talk more about the education savings and the retirement savings. So there's a few things I just want to point out that, even someone like me, I did right during the process. First of all, was way before this timeline, I brought joint workout. So I brought someone with me who knew more than I did, and I utilized those expertise as opposed to saying, you know what, this is a great case, and if I get it all, I'm going to make a lot of money, right? So I brought someone else out. We developed a relationship. If I hadn't done that, what could have happened is I might not have been there to get the call in '07. The second thing that I did right was I used Northwestern Mutual's process. This was a really strong referral. The mom called me and said they needed insurance. I know as a rep the lure to circumvent that process. I've heard so many times, make them a client, then do the plan. So instead of doing that, I didn't. I met with them and talked to them. Could have easily said, let me get your information over the phone, I'll bring out illustrations, we'll write some term, then we'll talk about other stuff. Because I didn't do that, and I followed my training, this disability insurance was implemented, thankfully. The third thing that I did right was I utilized Northwestern Mutual's value proposition. And for me, when I talk to people that have other planners, other advisors, very, very often it's all about Plan A. It's all about, what do you have in your investment program? What are you doing for retirement? What are you doing for college? Very, very often they're not talking about risk management, the insurance products. And you know what? We were founded as an insurance company, and not just in my opinion, but the opinion of many, many people, it's the best insurance company in the world. So I don't know why you wouldn't utilize that and talk about those risk management products. So it's not just about the client's plan, which is very often Plan A, but it's Plan B, what could happen. So I urge you guys to make sure that you're following the values of the company and following your values. It's not just to have a competitive edge in the market, it's really to do the right thing. So back to the story. Unfortunately, not long after that June of '08 meeting, for Chris and Brogann, Plan B happened. So let's take a look.
It was very inspiring to think of what Chris had sacrificed to be a part of the 2010 World Championships.
This man, Chris Sanderson, a remarkable story.
For him to play at the level he played, and he was fantastic.
Rabel from long range, and Sanderson responds, risking his life to play in this event.
It was that kind of an internal, kind of intangible competitive spirit that Chris had that, I think the reason why I was able to fight it for so long.
Unfortunately, with brain tumors, there are fingers that spread out all over the brain, and that's the problem with this type of tumor, is you can't get it all out.
But he just would not be deterred, inspirational, to the point where it took your breath away.
Everybody talks about laying on the line and putting out for the team, but when you actually see a guy do that, it's a big deal, and something that we'll never forget.
After beating the U.S. in the first match of the games behind Chris's 28 save performance, the Canadians would eventually fall to the Americans in the finals. But it did not diminish what Chris was able to do for over a decade for Team Canada. Constant and undeniable force in the net, an undoubted leader to his team. Chris was 3 times named All-World. In 2006, led Team Canada to the gold. Legendary lacrosse goalie Chris Sanderson lost his battle with brain cancer on June 28, 2012, at the age of 38.
His concern was first and foremost for his kids and Brogann and his teammates and his friends and his family. It was never about Chris. It was about fighting it for other people.
But I think that's his legacy, the impact that he had on others.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce my client and my friend, Brogann Sanderson Bowden, who volunteered to share her story with us.
My name is Brogann. Chris was my husband, and he is the father of our 2 daughters, Stevie and Clementine, who are now 10 and 8 years old. While I am honored and grateful to share my story with all of you, the truth is, I'm not supposed to be here today. Chris wasn't supposed to die in the prime of his life and at the height of his career. I wasn't supposed to become a widow at 36 years old. And my daughters were not supposed to lose their daddy before they even got to 1st grade. This wasn't my plan. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. I met Chris in 1994 at the University of Virginia. It was love at first sight for him. It took our entire freshman year, but as you just saw, he was very determined, and he eventually won me over. We graduated together in 1998, and we moved to Baltimore, where we both started our careers. Chris as a professional lacrosse player for the Baltimore Thunder, and me as a counselor working with troubled youth. A couple of years later, we moved to New Jersey, where I grew up. Then I went back to get my master's degree. Chris started a lacrosse company, running camps and clinics and tournaments. And I landed my first job as the Director of Counseling Services at the Pennington School. We bought our first house on Main Street in Pennington. We got a dog. We got married. And we had our first child. Chris's career was taking off, and my days were spent with play dates, play groups, feeding schedules, sleepless nights, trying to lose my baby weight, and complaining about Chris, about him never being home enough. Life was hectic, but it was good. And we were living my life plan to a T. Then, on October 15th, 2008, everything changed in an instant. Chris suffered a grand mal seizure on his way home from the gym. He was found on the side of the road by a stranger, ambulanced to the emergency room, admitted for testing, and the next day diagnosed with a brain tumor the size of an apple. That December, Chris had his first surgery to remove the visible tumor and determine pathology. We traveled down to Duke University Hospital for this first procedure. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with brain cancer and brain surgeries, the way these operations work, when a tumor is located in a particularly delicate area of the brain, the way that Chris's was located in the area of the brain that controls speech and language, is that doctors perform what they call an awake craniotomy, which essentially means that the patient is awake during the procedure. This allows doctors to electrically stimulate the tumor site and areas around the tumor so that they can see if there's any critical functioning and areas where they need to avoid so that they don't leave the patient compromised after the procedure. In Chris's case, prior to surgery, they showed him a series of flashcards with pictures of animals on them. They used this information as a baseline, asking him to label each picture, cat, dog, cow, and so forth. And then they repeated that process in the middle of the operation to see if there was any discrepancies, any areas of risk that they should avoid. About 6 hours into the operation, the surgeon came out in his scrubs to the waiting room. He said he had a remarkable story for me. He said that he had removed 95% of the tumor, and he was headed into the last little part, the last 5%, which prior to surgery, they had already mapped out significant verbal functioning, so they knew that this was a risky part of the operation. The surgeon instructed the medical team to stimulate the area and show Chris a flashcard, and they did. They showed him a picture of a bird. Prior to surgery, Chris had labeled this picture a duck. But when they were in the middle of surgery and they showed him the card, Chris responded that it was a goose. So the operating room froze. And the doctor instructed the medical team to attempt it again. Once again, they showed Chris a picture of the bird, and once again, this time with some hesitation, because I think he knew that he had gotten it wrong the first time, he responded, "It's a goose." As a result of the discrepancy, because prior to surgery he had called it a duck and now he was calling it a goose, the surgeon felt like it was too risky to continue with the procedure. It was over. They were just going to leave that last little part in. So everyone in the OR started to clean up, and the doctor leaned over to Chris and said, "You did a great job. It was a successful procedure. Well done." As the doctor was telling me this story, he started to get emotional, and he said, "Brogann, then the most amazing thing happened. I was walking out, I took off my gloves, I was walking out, and just as I approached the door, I heard Chris yell out, 'It's a duck. I know it's an effing duck. It just took me a minute, Doc. You gotta get back in there and take the entire tumor out.'" So they did. They went back in and they removed 100% of the visible tumor, which to this day, some experts say may have extended Chris and his life by months, if not years. When the doctor told me this story, he said he had never experienced anything like this before in his career. A patient on the table in the middle of a craniotomy actually coaching him to go back in and take out the entire tumor. He said it was a testament to Chris's drive, to his resiliency, and to his will to live. This story didn't surprise me. This was so Chris. When other people would be scared, when other people would cower away, Chris just went for it. It's what he did. And I hold on to this story because a few hours later, when Chris was recovering in the ICU, that same surgeon came to get me to speak to me again, only this time, the conversation had a much different tone. The pathology report was back, and the doctor wanted me to know what we were dealing with. He sat me down in a little room to the side of the ICU, and he said, "Brogann, Chris has what they call glioblastoma multiforme. It is the most aggressive and deadliest form of brain cancer. It is terminal in almost all cases, with a 2% 5-year survival rate." We had a 2-year-old and a 6-month-old at the time of diagnosis. This was not my plan. This was not supposed to happen. The next 4 years would be consumed by Chris's illness, by treatments, and ultimately with his death on June 28, 2012. In many ways, Chris's legacy is defined by his heroic battle with that dreadful disease. the way that he outlived all of the statistics, and how he lived his life with cancer. For me, those 4 years were spent trying to balance the needs of my dying husband and the needs of my 2 young daughters, which were never in sync. The guilt of failing one or the other was a constant. There just was not enough of me to go around. I tell people that GBM is a disease of losses, that patients typically start out looking and feeling pretty healthy. But over a relatively short period of time, they lose bits and pieces of their cognitive and physical functioning, which translates into losing bits and pieces of their identities, of who they are. Chris's first loss was word retrieval, which basically means that he knew what he wanted to say, but he couldn't figure out the word. I will never forget the day that he forgot Stevie's name. It was devastating to everyone, especially little Stevie, who was 3 years old at the time. Eventually, Chris was unable to drive because he was having so many seizures. Everyone in town had this image of Chris in his Jeep with the top down and the music blasting. But after some months, that Jeep just sat in our driveway. I stared at it every time I walked out the door, and it made me sad. Chris eventually lost his ability to read and write. There was a day when he came to me, and he told me that we were going to have to order books on tape because he could no longer read Stevie and Clementine their bedtime stories. I literally collapsed into a ball on my front porch the day that those boxes arrived, because I knew what they meant. They represented that I couldn't hide Chris's disease from the girls anymore, that they were going to start to feel it. Eventually, coaching and playing lacrosse became impossible for Chris. Lacrosse was Chris's life. It was his identity. It was his career. But he just had to stop working. We brought in friends and family to try to help keep Chris's businesses afloat. But the reality is that much of his work depended on Chris and Chris's talent. So eventually, Chris was unable to provide for our family, which was devastating for him. Eventually, he lost his ability to speak, which affected every aspect of his life, both personally and professionally. And for me, I had to be present for every visitor, every interview he had with the media, so that I could fill in the missing gaps and sort of smooth over some of the awkwardness when Chris couldn't say what he wanted to say and there was silence. I even delivered Chris's Hall of Fame induction speech while he stood next to me on stage fighting back tears. None of this was supposed to happen. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Chris always believed that he was going to be the one person to beat GBM, and he fought like nothing I have ever seen. We used every connection and every dime we had to travel to the best hospitals, to seek out the best treatments and clinical trials, to get the newest therapies and the most comprehensive treatment plans. The truth is, for me, I was desperate for some time out of that fight with Chris, at home, alone, with our girls. I wanted to talk to Chris about how he wanted his funeral to go. I wanted to ask him what he wanted me to do with his businesses after he was gone. I wanted him to make videos and write letters to Stevie and Clementine so that they had something to hold on to after he was gone. I wanted him to give me permission to remarry. But none of this ever happened. Chris was a competitor. He was an athlete. He faced every procedure and every minute of those 3.5 years like it was a game that he refused to lose. He rejected any hint of defeat. Defeat just wasn't part of his makeup. Even at the very end, and even up until his very last breath. Chris and I had a plan, and that plan did not include cancer. He was supposed to build his business. We were supposed to have more babies. He was supposed to walk Stevie and Clementine down the aisle. We were supposed to grow old together. But life doesn't always go the way it's supposed to, does it? This is why what you all do at Northwestern Mutual is so important. Chris and I met Jason Akers 10 months before we knew anything about Chris's illness. Despite our age and our healthy appearance, Jason knew that it was important to help us plan for the future in a realistic way. In our first meeting, he gathered information about our assets and our expenses and our goals. He explored hypotheticals with us that seemed really unlikely at the time. Could Chris, a business owner, get injured or sick? And might his temporary inability to work affect our income? That was unlikely, but possible, I guess. Could I die and leave Chris with the girls, needing to cover full-time childcare for a certain number of years so that he could continue to work and make an income? Again, unlikely, but possible. Could Chris die, leaving me with the girls, but with no steady income? Would I want the pressure of going back to work right away? How many years at our existing lifestyle and without having to move out of our home would we need? Unlikely, but more possible than I ever could have imagined. I thought Jason was a little nuts, but he got us thinking. He got us to consider the possibilities, and he got us to plan for the unexpected. He didn't scare us. He didn't seem unreasonable. He didn't push. He just presented real life what-ifs that resonated and seemed sensible. Most of all, Jason made us feel smart and responsible for tackling these kind of issues so seriously. A couple of weeks later, we met with Jason again to review his analysis and his recommendations. The truth is, at that point, Jason could have sold us a vacuum cleaner because the trust was there. We liked him, and we valued his expertise. So, We wrote the check, we signed the papers. Sure, Jason made the sale, which I know is important. But he also significantly impacted my life, the remainder of Chris's life, and perhaps most profoundly, my daughter's lives. Without disability insurance, Chris and I never would have been able to pay our bills, let alone travel around the country to all these different hospitals. Without disability insurance, I probably would have had to go back to work to supplement Chris's lost income. Without disability insurance, Chris probably would have received the standard of care for this type of cancer, and in all likelihood, he would have died within a year. Instead, we got 3.5 years with him. We spent those 3.5 years living life as fully as possible. We took photos, we made home videos, we threw huge birthday parties, we went on vacations. Chris and I didn't just buy an insurance policy from Northwestern Mutual, we bought time. Enough time that Stevie and Clementine both have real memories of their daddy. So, the next time that you are sitting with a client who balks at a monthly payment, I want you to have in your head my voice telling you that what you are selling that client is far more valuable than either of you even realize. It's true. After Chris died, I was crippled with grief. I was also a single mom with 2 little girls who needed me more than ever. The only thing that I can imagine being worse about that first year after Chris died would have been adding financial insecurity into the mix. I had medical and business debt. I had monthly personal expenses, many of which had been neglected in the months leading up to Chris's death. I had no job, and I had 2 children who depended on me for everything. Since Chris has died, I've connected with hundreds of young widows whose husbands have also died from GBM. And in my estimation, I would say more than half of them did not have any insurance lined up. So in the middle of this huge life tragedy, many of these women are also dealing with things like collectors calling the house 24/7, or having to file for bankruptcy, or having to move out of their home, sometimes the only home their children have ever known. They're having to leave their grieving children to go back to work. Because of Jason Akers and Northwestern Mutual, I didn't have to deal with any of this. I was able to focus on my girl. I was able to focus on my girls and help them grieve. I had enough quiet in my own life to grieve properly myself. And I had enough time to slowly pick up the pieces of our lives. It has been 4 years since Chris died, and 8 years since my life changed overnight. The girls miss Chris every single day, but they are resilient and strong and thriving. Stevie plays lacrosse. She wears number 17, and she's a goalie just like her daddy. It is emotional for me every time she goes into net. And Clementine reminds me every single day how silly and funny and inappropriate her daddy was. As for me, I recently remarried. Thank you. I married an amazing man named John Bowden, who, his wife also died from cancer the same year that Chris died, and her name was Christina. We lived in the same small town a block away from each other and didn't know one another existed. John has a son named Connor, now my stepson. Connor and Stevie, remarkably, were in the same class at the same small elementary school the year that they both lost a parent. The reality is that the girls and I will be grieving the loss of Chris for the rest of our lives in many ways. But the three of us were ready for this next chapter. We were ready, in part, because of the security and the stability provided to us by this amazing company. Thank you for letting me share Chris's story today. It is important for me to do it for a number of different reasons. Chris was such an amazing example of perseverance, of getting up every single day and giving it your all. I know that this career isn't easy at times. I know that you understand what it's like to get knocked down and what it takes to motivate yourself to get back up and keep plugging day after day after day. Think of Chris's inspirational fight when you're having a bad week. I also want you to know that you work for an amazing company with incredible integrity. There are other insurance companies who would have fought our claim because of the timing. You should feel good about working for Northwestern Mutual. And lastly, you need to know that you are doing such important work. You help families plan for the worst case scenario when they don't think it's ever going to happen. If my story isn't one big, giant validation, if it doesn't put your job and the value of your work into a perspective that you can hold on to and stand behind for the rest of your career, I don't know what will. Please take this moment. Take my experience and my gratitude with you to work every single day. Thank you, Northwestern Mutual. And from the bottom of my heart, thank you, Jason Akers.
Hold on one second. Just briefly, I just wanted to thank the Home Office for making this possible. I wanted to thank all of you here for the incredible work you do every day, and then obviously, most of all, thank Brogann for her amazing courage and that incredible speech in sharing her story with us. Thank you.